I'm delighted to welcome our guest onto the show this evening, James Giles, Councillor James Giles, who's a councillor down in Kingston upon Thames, an independent councillor down in Kingston upon Thames. He's also a part-time psephologist. He's been on the show before. Some of our regular viewers, I'm sure, will remember James when he came on with another guest speaking about the recent elections and want to talk about the future prospects for the elections next year, amongst other things. So welcome to the show, James. Good to have you back, mate. How are you?
Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, thanks for taking the time out to speak to us again. We appreciate that. There's a few things I just want to talk to you about. And obviously, one of the things that we've been focusing on quite a bit is the dreadful scenes in Gaza and the genocide that's being perpetrated by the Israeli regime. And we know now that I think the casualties are around 20,000, 7,000 or 8,000 children have been killed. And what's been particularly troubling, I think, from our perspective, certainly my perspective anyway, is that the lack of support for a ceasefire as a bare minimum from frontline politicians. In Parliament, we saw a vote being lost by a substantial margin, the Labour Party predominantly abstaining on it. We saw the United Kingdom abstaining at the United Nations Security Council when there was a resolution to bring about a permanent ceasefire, and they vetoed it on the first occasion, and they abstained, I think it was last week, when there was another attempt to try and force a ceasefire through. So the politicians have desperately let us down. And it's not just the politicians in Westminster. We've also seen a lack of support from councillors as well. And I know there's been quite a bit of pressure being put on town halls up and down the country to urge councillors to, express their revulsion and opposition to what's happening, and to take some practical steps to try and, put pressure on the policymakers to do the right thing. Now, I know you, James, you've been coordinating a letter from councillors calling for a ceasefire. So perhaps you could just start really by telling us about that, what prompted you to do that, and what kind of support you've received so far for the letter.
Yeah, sure, by all means. So you're quite right. I co-authored an open letter which was addressed to the Prime Minister, the Leader of the Opposition, and indeed all MPs who represent constituencies across the United Kingdom, urging them to support an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. A request for endorsement, if you like, a request to sign that letter was sent to all 19,000 councillors, England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, all parties and none. I'm pleased to say that over 1,000 councillors and counting have spoken up, have put their heads above the parapet to call for a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza, often against significant pressure from their parties to stay silent. A number of councillors, especially Labour and Conservative, choosing to sign the letter anonymously for fear of reprisals from their party machines and party whips, which really is a sorry state for our democracy to be in. Having said that, a good number of people have given their political life's blood standing up for the oppressed around the world. You, dare I say, are one of them. And, since this request for endorsement was sent out to councillors, I've faced a torrent of abuse, and indeed, the systems and powers that be have frankly tried to shut it down. The supposedly non-partisan local government association, which is meant to be the national voice of local government, decided to suspend me from my role on the City Regions Board. Now, quite what Israel-Palestine has to do with improving urban spaces is beyond me. But they decided to take that action, and that is a suspension that is currently under review. And indeed, my co-author of the open letter, perhaps surprisingly, a Conservative councillor alongside me in Kingston, or should I say a now former Conservative councillor, also facing retaliation from his party, But I'm pleased to say he now sits with me as an independent in Kingston, and we now form the main opposition on the council, not the Conservatives. So, there's swings and roundabouts, but all of this, I'm afraid to say, the furore and the faux outrage on social media has detracted from the main issue at hand, which is the killing of innocent women, innocent children in Gaza, and the continuing humanitarian crisis and catastrophe that's going on there. That is what people have tried to do. They've tried to deflect attention away from the issue and instead make it all about me, which it really isn't.
Incredible. James, what reason did the LGA, the Local Government Association, give for suspending you? Was it simply about the letter, or did they make up some other story to...
Well, look, in the letter, in the email that was sent to councillors, we said that in the interest of accountability, we'd also published a list of names of councillors who were invited to sign but chose not to. Now, let me be clear. This has been deliberately misconstrued by people who would never have dreamed of signing the letter in the first place to mean we're going to publish every councillor's name in the country, which would be moronic because it would waive the anonymity offered. But, councillors who write to me comments like, as one councillor did, Gaza should be razed to the ground. Frankly, those people should be held accountable for their views, just as I'm held accountable for mine. And I've been held accountable and then some by people who clearly do not support a ceasefire. Now, this line was taken as the reason for suspension. It was deemed a threat to councillors by the Local Government Association. But, this is complete codswallop. Politicians and political parties regularly name politicians who do not agree with their point of view. The National Green Party recently gave a list of MPs who refused to back a ceasefire. I applaud them for doing so. Even Sir Keir Starmer released a list of names of Tory MPs who did not vote to extend free school meals. I have a lot to say about Sir Keir Starmer, but frankly, he was right to do that. And finally, perhaps the most egregious, and this is maybe where it does border, something a bit more sinister. Alistair Campbell last year tweeting, if you have a Tory MP, go and find them this weekend and let them know what you think of what's just happened. This was with respect to a vote about the discharge of sewage. Now, what I'm suggesting, frankly, is holding elected representatives accountable. It may make people feel uncomfortable. They may not wish to be held accountable for their views. But frankly, if they don't want to be held accountable, then they shouldn't be putting themselves forward for public office in the first place. But it was far from a threat. This has been deliberately misconstrued by people who would never have signed the letter in the first place.
No, indeed. I was interested in what you said, James, about the fact that a number of councillors have signed it anonymously. I mean, that's a curious state of affairs. I know there's a line in the Labour Party anthem, which isn't really appropriate for the Labour Party anymore, but the red flag. But it says, "Oh, cowards," where it says, "Though cowards flinch and traitors sneer." It seems that there's a good deal of cowardice out there, isn't it? I know that people are being pressured by their parties, but if you're in an elected position, surely, in my opinion, you should stand up for what's right. Maybe people look to my case and think, well, actually, he stood up for what's right, and look what happened to him. He got kicked out of the party. But, I just think having an elected position, does put you under an obligation, really, to speak out. I mean, at least, I guess some of them are putting their names, as you say, anonymously. There may be many others who would wish to sign it, but, aren't even prepared to do that anonymously. I mean, what do you make of this level of cowardice and indeed intimidation, which is prompting this cowardice to rear its head?
Well, I think it's a great travesty, and it's a real sad indictment of the state of British democracy as it currently stands. I'm not surprised by it, I may add. I had one Conservative councillor in the neighbouring borough of Sutton in South London write to me with a torrent of abuse, adding, don't expect to work with us anytime soon. We don't back this, etc., etc. A number of profanities in there as well, which I won't repeat. The irony was, and I took great joy in writing back to this councillor to say, your ward colleague has signed this letter.
Oh, really? Yeah. Interesting, yeah.
And another Sutton Conservative councillor has signed anonymously. And when I see how you're writing to me, it does not surprise me that colleagues feel the need to write anonymously, because your language is obscene, quite frankly, and entirely inappropriate for anyone who holds elected office. With respect to the Labour Party, I may say, and this is just me sort of analysing the patterns in the data that's coming through, it's staggering the number of councillors who are due to be re-elected in May, or due to have elections in May, who have signed anonymously. And I think there's a fear, particularly among those who are coming toward the end of their term, who wish to stand again, that the Labour Party will rain down on them like a ton of bricks if they speak out. And look, we've seen over the last 4 years and beyond, you know, from your good self to the dozens of councillors who have been suspended for speaking out on various issues, to MPs who have been suspended pending a spurious investigation that seems often to take many years, hopefully with a view that it won't have completed by the time of the next election, if I'm being cynical. So I can understand why people don't wish to put their name to something quite as bold. But my point is this, quite frankly. If you don't want to stand up for what you believe in, what's the point of doing it in the first place?
Yeah, indeed, well, that's right. That's certainly my view, and was always the view I held all the way through my time as a member of the Labour Party. And I was a member for nearly 44 years, and I was an elected member for about 27 years on local authorities and in Parliament. And I always felt it was appropriate to speak up for what you believed in. And indeed, the Labour Party did, even under Tony Blair, let's be honest about it, did used to tolerate dissension, as it were. And indeed, George Galloway, I just want to go on to talk about in a moment, when he was expelled from the party, when he went to the Kangaroo Court hearing to put his case, he was flanked by Tony Benn and Michael Foot, who were speaking on his behalf. And I believe that Jeremy Corbyn and various others were outside on a picket of the National Executive Committee meeting, supporting George's position and calling for any disciplinary action against him to be dropped and for his place to be sustained in the Labour Party. And they received no disciplinary action as a consequence of that. And yet now, if people speak out for people, indeed, that was one of the main reasons that I was attacked was for speaking out for grassroots activists and prominent activists, people like Ken Livingston and Jackie Walker and Tony Greenstein and various other high-profile activists, and that was used as a pretext to kick me out, and I was alleged to be guilty of a pattern of behaviour of facilitating anti-Semitism. Total nonsense, of course. But just moving on though to George. And he's somebody, and we've talked about cowardice, who was a very antithesis of cowardice, and somebody who has always spoken out for what he believes in and spoken up for the underprivileged and spoken out against the war machine and imperialism. His record is unimpeachable, really. I mean, a lot of people may not be aware that, George, as a young man, was working undercover in apartheid South Africa, putting his life on the line. So, his record speaks for itself. And of course, as I've just said, George suffered at the hands of the party when he was the Labour Party, that is, and was expelled from the party. But after that, he founded the Respect Party and got elected. And then lost his seat, though, that was at the 2005 election, and he lost it in 2010, but then won a by-election, famous by-election in Bradford. And but regrettably, he wasn't able to hold on to it in the subsequent election. Some question marks about what went on in the background there, but that being said, that's what happened. And he put in a very creditable performance in the Batley and Spen by-election. Actually, I went up and campaigned for George for about a fortnight up there, and the support for him was palpable. But unfortunately, he didn't get quite over the line. However, as you know, James, he has announced his intention to stand for the mayor of London. And I think, given George's record in speaking out for the people of Palestine and speaking out against the Zionist entity, the Israeli regime, and given the level of anger and revulsion at the Israel's genocide that they're perpetrating in Gaza now, and given that there, feelings are running very, very high, and in London in particular, there is a huge cohort of support for the Palestinian people. I wonder, given George's intention to stand for mayor, what you think his chances are of success? He did get a quite a good vote, I think, last time. I think it was over 100,000. The system of electing the mayor this time is different. It's not the preferential vote system, is it? It's the first past the post system. So just tell us about what you make of George's candidature and what you think his chances are, his prospects are of actually pulling off a famous victory.
Sure. I mean, look, you're quite right when you say, first of all, this will be the first elections in London which will not have been elected on a first choice, second choice basis. This will be simple, straight, first past the post. I would expect there to be some 20 candidates, if not more, as there was in the last London mayoral election, which was delayed until 2021 because of COVID. Which reduces the percentage vote you need to win, quite frankly. Susan Hall, the Conservative candidate, widely seen as the main challenger to Sadiq Khan, I think by the day is proving herself to be widely unfit for the job and, dare I say, delusional and mad. Most recently, going on the airwaves across London on LBC, and indeed Talk TV across the country to say that her purse had been stolen on the London Underground, when in fact she had dropped it and a Good Samaritan had handed it into lost property, merely trying to score a political point about crime on the Underground. So I think actually the more voters get to know and hear Susan Hall, the less inclined they will be to vote for her. Sadiq Khan is not a popular mayor across London, especially in outer London. The ultra-low emission zone expansion has caused a groundswell of people opposing it, particularly in the boundaries of London. The largest Facebook group against ULEZ has over 80,000 members. Crime under Sadiq Khan has skyrocketed, and don't forget, he is the ultimate commissioner of the metropolis, of the Metropolitan Police. And under his watch, the foot has just been taken off the pedal. He claims to have built numerous affordable homes. Well, as most of us know, his definition of affordable, which he changed, is not truly affordable for the vast majority of working people across London. And of course, TfL still is running a deficit and is reliant on government handouts. They may not even be able to buy new trains that are due to enter commission on the Piccadilly line next year. So there's a litany of failures that can be rightly levied at Sadiq Khan. And with the right campaign, I do think Sadiq Khan is very much a beatable candidate. He is vulnerable. The Conservatives have chosen a pup, so it certainly won't be them. So it'll be really very interesting. I mean, you mentioned George's election in 2005. That was in the Bethnal Green and Bow constituency, which is in East London, in Tower Hamlets. So I would expect him to get a good deal of support there. Tower Hamlets, of course, in 2022, in the local elections, ousted the Labour Party in favour of a left-wing localist party led by Lutfur Rahman, who was the former mayor of Tower Hamlets. They have a majority control on the council. And if we look to two recent by-elections in the London borough of Newham, also in East London, independents have broken through there and now again, like in Kingston, form the main opposition to the administration. And Labour suffered what can only be described as a landslide defeat in that most recent by-election in Plaistow North, where previously they captured some 70% of the vote. That dropped to low to mid-30s. I don't have the exact figures. So Labour really are on the ropes in some parts of London. And there is an opportunity, I think, for someone who is pro-justice, pro-peace, pro-Londoner to capitalise.
Yeah. I mean, of course, George has got a lot of experience in local government as well. I mean, many people will know of him, obviously, as a parliamentarian and then obviously as a broadcaster. But in his younger days, he was the leader of Dundee Council. Very, very, very innovative leader of Dundee Council. So, you know, he's got the experience, albeit from some time ago in local government. And I think, you know, were he to be able to make a breakthrough, I think he would be an excellent mayor of London. And, you know, look, it's been done before, hasn't it, James? Where an independent, you know, has stood when Ken Livingstone was done over by the Labour Party and not selected, even though he was the popular choice for grassroots members, and he stood as an independent and won. And then Blair panicked at the next election and invited him back into the party, so they weren't going to get defeated again. What sort of, you know, with your psephology sort of expertise, James, and given that it is a different electoral system now for this election, what sort of vote do you, and I know it's a bit of a kind of stab in the dark, but what sort of vote do you think would be necessary to actually win? I mean, how many votes are we looking at as a winning total in this election?
That really depends on turnout. And Rishi Sunak is looking ever more vulnerable by the day. So, you know, we could well be heading for London elections and a general election on the same day, which would really skew, I think, the number of votes required, because a general election turnout is significantly higher than that of a London election. In London elections, you can usually expect circa 40% of the electorate to turn out. In a general election, you'd expect high 60s, maybe even pushing 70%, you know, especially, I think, in the current climate. But having said that, you know, the Green Party will amass their usual 8% of the vote. The Liberal Democrats will amass similar. You know, let's take 20% out of the equation for those two parties, and let's add another 5% for fringe candidates who are standing for whatever peculiar reason led them to throw £10,000 deposit at a race they'll never win. So, you know, you've got then 75% of the vote to play with. My own view is, you know, 33% of the vote ought to get a candidate elected if George or third party does come along as a viable challenger, which in the current circumstances, I think it's ripe to do. I'll leave aside the conversation about, in my view, the perversity of someone being elected with only 1 in 3 votes. But the threshold is low in order to get somebody elected. And yeah, my bet would be a third of the vote would almost certainly get a candidate over the line.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any sort of idea what that would be in actual hard numbers, assuming a 40% turnout? Would it be about 300,000 or 400,000? Would it be?
Oh, I mean, it's marginally higher than that. So you're looking at probably about, I'd say, 750,000, all in all. When George ran for the mayoralty in 2016, and of course at that point in time, Palestine was not a major issue. Sadiq Khan was a fresh candidate without any record. Boris Johnson obviously standing down because he had just just been elected as an MP and just finishing his term as mayor. There wasn't really anything to hit Sadiq with. He was a fresh face promising something different. But the fact we've now had 8 years, I beg your pardon, of Sadiq by the time of the election, his record really does speak for itself. So, get 750,000 Londoners, you could well do it. And George, of course, last time amassed, including second choices, over 200,000 votes. So is it out of the question? No, it's not.
No. Well, I would urge anybody who is disgruntled with the political class and who live relatively local to go along and lend their support to George's campaign. But again, just drawing on your psephological experience, James, the opinion polls seem to be putting Labour well. I know these kind of narrowed a bit, but they seem to be putting Labour well ahead in the opinion polls. And yet we're seeing these astonishing local council by-election results where Labour are being trounced. I mean, you've mentioned a couple of them earlier in our conversation. How do you account for that? I mean, are the polls just wrong, or what's happening?
Well, look, I mean, first of all, local elections aren't always indicative of a national trend, although I would say in this case, seemingly there is a trend of sorts. I think there's a lack of a national party that's been given airtime by the mainstream. I think if a pro-Palestinian left party was included in the poll that's undertaken by YouGov, Savanta, Conres, whoever it may be, they would get a good chunk of support. And when that option is on the ballot paper, whether it's through the Workers' Party, whether it's the Newham Independents, whether it's Aspire, clearly voters are going to them in their droves, which is a real headache for Labour. It's one of the reasons why the mainstream media, in my view, is so hesitant to cover alternative voices, which in turn makes it so hard for people to break through. But if you look at the polling, although it shows a great Labour lead, there is no love for Keir Starmer among the general public. There's hatred for Rishi Sunak, but there is no love for Keir Starmer, which really, I think, creates an opportunity at the next election for an alternative to step forward. There was a recent poll that said 40% of the British public would consider voting for a new party that in its current form doesn't exist. There's a golden opportunity here, and only time will tell whether it will actually come to fruition and break through. And unfortunately, quite a lot of that, although the influence is decreasing, does rely upon the tabloids, the broadcast media, and others.
Yeah, no, indeed. Interesting, that poll you mentioned. I know there was another poll that, I don't know, was it about a year ago, maybe now? I think it may have been slightly less than that. The Independent reported something like 2 out of 3 people were, would be interested in a new party to challenge both the Conservatives and the Labour Party. And on that point, James, perhaps finally, in terms of this conversation today, the Workers' Party of Britain, as you may or may not have seen, have identified at least 50 seats where the majority that the Labour Party enjoys is significantly lower than the concern within the electorate about the situation in Palestine, the situation in particular in Gaza, which does lend an opportunity, therefore, so the Workers' Party feel, for the Workers' Party to, make an impact in those constituencies. And, we're looking to identify candidates now who might be willing to stand in those constituencies. And of course, we're prepared to, work with other, progressive socialist political parties who may or may not have a greater chance in those constituencies, and indeed, for that matter, independents as well. The key thing, it seems to us, is that we need to ensure that we try to make some electoral breakthroughs and get people elected into Parliament that actually will speak up for peace and speak up for economic justice for working class communities in this country, which is sadly lacking. There is nobody, or very few people, speaking up on those issues, if anybody really, in Parliament. Maybe the odd one or two, but it's very few and far between. There's no kind of full-throated support for an anti kind of neoliberal economic agenda and putting forward a economic justice and class politics front and center, and indeed speaking up for peace and speaking up for the Palestinian people. And there's a variety of reasons for that, which we've already gone into. I mean, cowardice and pressure and all the rest of it that is applied to those individuals, which make them unwilling to put their head in these parliamentarians we're talking about, to put their head above the parapet. So just on that point, James, I mean, again, drawing on your psephological experience, what's your thoughts about the Workers' Party's prospectus, where they feel that there are at least 50 seats where they could make an impact and maybe make a breakthrough and actually win some of those seats. Do you think that's realistic or not?
Yeah, look, I mean, my advice is always focus on where you think you can win and don't spread yourself too thin. That's always my advice. I do think there is an opportunity in those seats, and dare I say, even in a few more, to make a real impact, potentially in some to break through. And it's really pleasing to hear, obviously, that the Workers' Party will also liaise with other left-wing groups, because the biggest risk, as I see it, to the left is a fracturing and splintering, and frankly, the infighting that we've seen, in the Labour Party, just gets translated onto a wider ballot paper. If you have the Workers' Party tasked to transform left unity, and goodness knows who else all standing in the same seat, then if you've got potentially a 30% share there of people who want to endorse a true alternative to Labour, that gets split and Labour get in down the middle. That's the nature of our voting system. And so I do think there's a real possibility for an alternative to come through, but it requires that cooperation, those discussions, to make sure everyone's efforts, insofar as possible, are coordinated. Otherwise, what could be 30% for one group gets split into 5% among six.
No, indeed. And ultimately, James, I would like to see a situation where, we maybe, through our endeavours, obviously I'd love to see a Workers' Party majority, but I don't think we're even going to be able to, we haven't got the resources at the minute to field sufficient candidates to form a majority government. But I think we might be in a situation where, smaller parties like the Workers' Party, if we can make a breakthrough, force a situation where it's a hung parliament, and then maybe we could bring about some sort of electoral reform. What's your thoughts on that? I used to be an advocate of first past the post when I was a dyed-in-the-wool Labour activist. Always felt that, the best thing is if we can get a strong majority Labour government. I was pretty naive because obviously, a lot of the people in the parliamentary Labour Party weren't ever really interested in progressive socialist and anti-imperialist policies. But nevertheless, that was my view that, that the first past the post gives you the chance to get a strong government. I've very much changed my view now. And I changed my view, some time ago, actually, when I was still a member of the Labour Party and when I was leading the Democracy Roadshow. One of the things I was advocating, getting thoughts about from constituency party meetings all over the country, was their thoughts about electoral reform and whether we should push it. And what was interesting was that even in safe Labour seats, there was a lot of support for it, but particularly in those seats where I spoke, where the Labour Party was a distant second or even third, that activists there felt that their votes, their campaigning in the local area was pretty pointless, really, because you'd never really see any benefit from that in terms of electoral success. And so that resulted in less activity locally and people maybe just going and campaigning in other areas. And they felt that if there was some sort of electoral reform, every vote would count, and that would make them more inclined to campaign in their local area and have a presence. So I don't know. What's your thoughts about that? And do you think it's a realistic prospect that we might, if we can get a hung parliament, force the vested interests to actually support it in the end?
Well, look, I would say, should it be a Labour Liberal Democrat coalition, which is probably the most likely outcome, bar a Labour majority, that PR would probably be on the agenda, or electoral reform would be on the agenda. Except we know what the Liberal Democrats are like, and their red lines are about as useful as a chocolate teapot. We saw that with tuition fees back in 2010. So whilst I live in some hope, and believe me, I don't often hope for Liberal Democrats in government, but on this one issue, whilst I hope for a Liberal Democrat voice in government, simply to push electoral reform, I don't see it happening anytime soon, I'm afraid. Keir Starmer, of course, when he was standing for Labour leadership, made great hay about his support for electoral reform. And despite the Democratic Labour conference voting for it last year, it's been completely ignored by the Labour leadership. So I don't believe we'll get that over the line anytime soon. It's of no surprise that small parties and independents typically support PR. My one caveat when it comes to electoral reform is making sure that, insofar as possible, there's still a link between elected representatives and local geographic areas and constituencies. Many advocate for a list system, as other countries like Germany have, but for huge regions, you could have MPs for all of London. But my fear would be that MPs would pass the buck from one to the other. There could be huge duplication of work, and indeed that lack of direct accountability that we spoke a little bit about earlier when we were speaking about Gaza. Now, there are other forms of PR that enable that constituency link. Germany, I come back to again, does it relatively well insofar as they have constituencies and they have what they call top-up seats, which works in a very similar way to how the London elections actually work with assembly members. That I would certainly be in favour of. It redresses the balance and gives, I don't like the term smaller parties, but for want of a better phrase, smaller parties a voice and representation. So let's see where we end up. But unfortunately, I don't see it realistically on the table happening anytime soon.
Well, it's always, look, Tony Blair even, back in the day, I think like Sir Keir Starmer spoke supportively about PR, but then when push came to shove, they never ever followed through with it. But then I think perhaps what we need to hold true to is Nelson Mandela's maxim that it always seems impossible until it's done. And there are many areas of public life where it might seem impossible, but we need to push for, and when it's done, then it was always on the cards. I'm sure people will no doubt say they always supported it. But anyway, let's wait and see what happens there. But thanks very much indeed, James, for taking the time out to speak to us this evening.
My pleasure.
Really good to have you on the show again. Thank you, everybody, for watching today. We hope to be back at the same time next week. So until then, this is Chris Williamson saying bye for now.